Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Thursday, April 24th, 2025 at 11:34 in the morning, 10:34 in the morning, excuse me. So now we're here to look at a draft of the CHIP section of S-127. We have our Legislative Counsel, John Gray, with us. John, good morning. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for having the ability to join us.
Good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will jump in as soon as I get into the Zoom. But just briefly, what I'm planning on doing today, and I can of course do as you guys please, but there have been a few requested updates to the CHIP proposal made throughout this week. And so I have a draft language. It's not in the form of a bill or an amendment. It's just a proposal because the posture is that you guys don't have a bill and you're just proposing particular language to out general. So I will put together, or what you'll see is a single strike of the CHIP subchapter in S-127 and a complete replaceal with this proposal. But note that most of the text is what you've already seen. Any changes against the language as received in S-127 from the House will be shown in highlight. So it's going to be pretty easy to flick through the individual changes and talk about each of them. And then we can, depending on committee's appetite, we can have plenty of time to either talk about those changes or we can talk more broadly about how the program works. And thank you for the Zoom link. I'll be in it just a second. And thank you for the evidence. Good. Yeah. Okay. Is that visible to you guys? You see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, so as I was noting, any unhighlighted text is as received from the Senate. So I'm just going to flip quickly through those section and hit the changes. But please tell me if you would like to pause on a particular piece and I can try to address those things. So the first change that you're going to see here is really showing up in two places. This, what you see at the bottom of page 1 highlighted, the definition of housing development. And you'll see this as well in the project criterion, which is part of the BEPC application process. This is basically the response to, you recall the prior draft just talked about development that includes housing, and it had that kind of just includes housing. It didn't have any particular floor area requirement or unit requirement. It just said to include housing. So this is an attempt to beef up the housing component of the program, and it provides for two alternatives. And it's going to become clear once we get to the actual project application section. But what you can see here is you can meet one of two conditions. You can meet this 60% of the aggregate gross floor area upon completion is dedicated to housing. So that's a minimum floor area dedicated to housing. Or there is an alternative process if you think that you can't meet that particular tariff, you might be at a threshold. And that's this other piece, which is, we'll come to it later, but the creation of a board that would be able to grant approval on basically a discretionary basis if they found that particular conditions were met. So we'll come to that, but your housing development definition has to pick these up because this is describing what constitutes that development. The next change you're going to see is on page 2 to the definition of improvements. You'll recall that the definition of improvements before was installation or construction of infrastructure, and then it had a lengthy list of things that might constitute infrastructure. What this draft proposes to do is not to provide a general concept infrastructure and then spell out potential items that could count. It just outright says what those things are. I will note that one of the dangers of doing this is that you do need to capture all of the things that you want to pick up. And so what you're going to see here is a language that is drawn from the 2015 TIP rules that describes some of the things that BEPC has described as infrastructure. It does omit a couple of pieces, and I have ready an alternative, much more generic concept that you could use to do this. So before I get to the language, one alternative way to do this would just be to say the installation or construction of utilities or water or road infrastructure. And that would be kind of big buckets that get at core things that you might think of as tied to it. But the question I think that you guys are posing is, what are the kind of things that you want to finance that you think will stimulate housing development? And so these are meant to get at those things, but definitely would want to hear feedback because, as I said, I put this together on the basis of the 2015 TIF rules on the guidance that I had received, but there's been no exhaustive discussion of this list of items. So what you see here is classic utilities, so power or telecommunications infrastructure, wastewater, stormwater, water dispersal, water collection, water treatment facilities and equipment, or related wastewater, stormwater, or water equipment. So water infrastructure, public roads, streets, bridges. Note this doesn't say parking or garages, but does say multimodal facilities. So contemplating different transportation, but you could have parking and the like here. Public transit stop equipment and amenities, street and sidewalk lighting, sidewalks, streetscapes, wayfinding signs and kiosks, traffic signals, medians, or turn lanes. And I'll just say, if you're interested, I don't have a tab open to this, but it wouldn't be hard for me to do this to pull open the 2015 TIF rules so you could see where I drew this from, or after committee, I could send you guys an email that contains that. And like I said, if you take an approach like this, you need to make sure that you pick up everything you want to get. Because this is not an inclusive list. This is the set of things that are permissible as improvements. So that's kind of your classic infrastructure pieces in that. And then the second piece here is site preparation for redevelopment or development, including land and property acquisition, demolition, brownfield remediation, or flood remediation and mitigation. So those are concepts that were in the prior draft. It does include that flood remediation and mitigation. So some of this is, I would say conceptually, this is consistent with a lot of what the prior definition of improvements was getting at, but it is exhaustive as to what things you can do. So things to call out that you don't see listed here. You don't see broadband or digital infrastructure listed in this. You don't see parking called out or public facilities. So this is I would say this is a big area for discussion depending on what folks do.
Yeah, so there's a phrase in there that starts public roads, streets, bridges.
You asking him what public applies to, or?
Yeah, and what does public mean, I guess, too? If you have, say, a small development and you're putting in some driveway of some sort to serve that little development, is that included in the?
Yeah, my guess, and it would be me guessing, I wouldn't think of a driveway as constituting a public road. So I think to that particular place. But to your question as to how to read this, the first that I would offer is this is what is in the 2015 TIF rules. But my reading would be, because you see public called out in multiple instances, like you have public roads, you don't have public here, you don't have public here, but you do have public here. One reading is,
Oh,
I'm envisioning these to be public bridges. Like, why would that not be public bridges? So maybe it's just loosely drafted, right? Naturally, I would think that if you've chosen to include public in some places and you've chosen to not include it in others, that would seem to suggest that public doesn't apply or you don't have it. But I just can't envision people are talking about private bridges, so.
It might, you have your little development occurring in this field, and all of a sudden, again, you have to build something over the wet spot there. Might be a bridge.
Yeah, I just can't imagine that you would want to have private bridges, but not public, right? Like if that was a permissible use. So, so I think I'm agreeing with you that if this is a concept you guys want, we should be clear what public applies to. And I completely agree. It is not clear in this language.
Yeah, if you could send that
To TIF rules? Yeah.
You mentioned parking not being one of the things, and I'm just thinking of some, municipalities that might have I'll tell you for a perfect example, you want to put a 250 unit building here, you need structured parking in the city. And just pointing that out as if that's not covered in that language, we probably should have it. because parking will kill a project just as quickly as not having water.
And just to make clear, the 2015 tip rules do speak to parking. I had understood from the direction I received, but I might have misunderstood that parking was not desired, but I'm happy to do whatever you guys want.
Is there anything on parking not being desired?
Needs to park the car.
I mean, if I could just interject with planning, I mean, typically in a planning situation, parking is a requirement that that whoever the developer is going to have to put in. You have to have a certain amount, especially residential. You have to have a certain amount of parking spaces per. So if they're going to build a residential unit anyway, they're going to need to include parking whether we fund it or not.
Yeah.
So just kind of to add some context there, I don't know. Because remember, we're thinking about how we're going to, giving them the money to do this. So I don't know as if it's,
But if, for example, if this is in Montpelier, like if the parking would not be taken on in the downtown here, it would not be taken on by the private entity. That would be infrastructure. I think they had this problem, and I'm not really clear on Montpelier politics. So, but I think they actually had a problem with parking and it killed a project. Is that anybody here from Montpelier know about that? Okay, I'm almost positive it did. It was a downtown. They were going to do structured parking and it didn't work out. And if I recall, it killed the project as well, but could be wrong. But either way, we should probably have parking in this. If we're going to list out all the things, it would be my preference to go back to more broad look at it. But if we're gonna, parking really should be in there.
So you might not be able to answer this. Centerville has digital infrastructure, and this talks about telecommunications infrastructure. Any real difference there?
I would envision digital as broader. I know that one of the thinking behind, I say that, one of the things I recall on the Senate side were discussions around whether broadband was coverable. And even if folks thought that infrastructure conceivably covered that, folks out in the world didn't feel satisfied unless they had an explicit call out. So I think that some of what's going on in that area was conceivably it could be covered right, but people want the direct call out to know that they're safe. So I would have to do more digging as to what distinguishes telecommunications and digital. But I think that there was a desire, at least on the Senate side that I recall, which is to have explicit call outs, even if you might be coverable, just so folks feel comfortable putting in an application.
It's related.
And broadband was the specific one that I recall being, folks wanted that call out.
So I think in the original Senate, well, anyway, development needs water supply. And I'm wondering whether water collection is sufficient to cover all parts of the water supply infrastructure.
Yeah, no, I mean, you guys are asking all the right questions. Like this is an exhaustive list. So that's part of why I had cautioned that if you do something, another alternative is to have a broader call out, right? Something like power, telecommunications, or water, or road infrastructure, right? Transportation infrastructure. And you could have, and then people would just have conversations as to what constitutes that kind of infrastructure. But then it just depends on how prescriptive you want to be, right? Like what kinds of things do you think you need to incentivize to stimulate housing development? And you don't have to pick up everything, right?
These pieces that aren't in here, can be pieces that are used to incent multi-use, multi-purpose building, right?
Mixed use.
Mixed use.
Mixed income housing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's mixed use.
I
And maybe-
understand.
If we want to incentivize mixed income housing,
Okay.
perhaps one of the ways to do it is if you're building mixed income housing, you have a bigger list of items that you can choose from in your infrastructure that you can get funding for.
Oh, yeah, sure. I understand.
I love it.
Just need to make sure that
I love it.
the list includes the items of infrastructure that are needed for the mixed use or whatever.
Yeah, so, I mean,
Maybe sidewalks.
the bare minimum of,
Right, sidewalks, right. I
Parking,
mean,
yeah.
a lot of the 1B requirements, I think, have a sidewalk requirement.
sure. But, and that municipality may have requirements, but in this program doesn't mean we fund them all. Unless we want to incent that mixed.
Like this new level of complication, John.
I could definitely do this. I will just need to know what the.
Right.
I think it should be super restricted down to like just the basic essentials.
Right.
And then if you want the extra goodies,
Why do we think this will work?
I will say I have seen it work. In Philadelphia, parking in particular was held. So if you added parking to your development, you could get an extra 10 feet of airspace. If you added a rain garden, you can actually get an extra 5 feet of airspace. So, and those incentives, honestly, they did work. I mean, probably should recheck on how the rain gardens are doing, but
May I ask what the thing that I had heard you might want to encourage was mixed use with expanded categories. Do you, and that's fine if that's what you want to do, but if the goal of the program is to produce the most housing, is that I guess you're just saying to get through the door, if you want to do this kind of project, it's not really incentive, it's more like you only have access to these funds if you meet extra conditions. Just trying not to make sure you're making it harder for. I'll think about it. Yeah.
I mean, say the list right here. Say that's the minimum you need to get for a project. So, but if you can include all the other, the things that we'd like to incent, we'd like lower income, middle income,
Oh, okay. Okay.
housing units to be built, then you can include, public facilities,
Yep.
Sidewalks, parking, that type of thing.
Okay.
If Mike, you suggested that, I envision perhaps this is a means to get to incentivizing the cluster housing we might like to see in our 2B areas as a,
Tier 2?
yeah, sorry, yeah. The denser the housing, the more that you could use for, the more of the tax increment you could use for offsetting your then required parking requirements.
Yep.
This is one tool.
I just want to go on the record and say like the more open-ended version, where we're not being overly prescriptive.
Agree with that. I would tend to agree too. At least, I think there's some elements of infrastructure that are necessary for any housing project.
Right, that's what we wanted, so that's what we want. But then if you go over and above to incent the other parts of housing, then that can be funded also with the CHIP.
And I guess maybe it's specific to the details of what's the essential list and what's the
Right.
extra.
Yeah, that's what we haven't made the list, it's just the concept of.
Guys, yeah, and you said, gonna bring in witnesses. be nice to see, some sort of developer, is that the essential list that is necessary to do any project?
Just remember that we probably aren't gonna get it all right. That we may have to adjust it again next year, because we may hear that we missed something that should be in there. I don't think you're gonna see. Because I just don't see where we're gonna start handing chip projects out till we come back. So there's always the opportunity to understand that we didn't get it all right, and we need to add more to either the basic or.
Sure.
So,
Yeah, I understand that, but that's the two different approaches, right? The Senate bill, you wouldn't have that.
sure, but
problem.
then we're gonna have Pepsi go through a rulemaking process that we heard they weren't crazy about doing because they felt that it was gonna hold them up too long. And anything we can do, because more open-ended you have it, they have to go into rulemaking and figure out all of that stuff. So
I get it.
I think we have to weigh all of that.
Yeah, and we need to make a list first to have a intelligent
Right,
conversation.
and that's the start of a list.
Yeah.
Are there more things that need to be added to the basic? So I think we need to figure out that, we have it's kind of like your cable, you have your basic program and then you can add more, right?
I don't care as long as the Red Sox are.
Getting messy. Yeah, but that's,
Should we start listing those or should we wait for?
well, I think what we should be doing is thinking about it.
Yeah, that's
And I
fine.
think we can have some conversations. There's plenty of smart people that are sitting around.
Yeah.
Table, listening to what we're talking about, that can look at that and give us opinions of.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Are we missing something, or do we have something in there that shouldn't be in there, that type of.
I'm thinking of the regular TIF. And, to me, the difference between the additional fun features of CHIP, that's where I could see adding in, additional stipulations. So for example, the sponsor, making agreements with the sponsors and paying the project owner, throughout the term, that could require adding those additional stipulations on, but to just get in through the door, I would, my preference, and I'll just edit there, is I think we should just keep the original language of TIF.
Soldier on, yeah. Okay. So this will be, obviously continued discussion on this one, and happy to update today, tomorrow, just depending on when folks get to a agreed place. We can jump all the way down. Actually, let me pause this so I'm not just scrolling. To your application process, which is on page 7. This is section 1910, the infrastructure project application. And you'll recall you have your application, you have your review process requirements. But beyond these, we have a project criterion. And this is tied to what we were talking about when we talked about the updated definition of housing development. So PEPC to review that housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the housing development plan meets either of the following criteria. So it can, on the numbers, meet what you see in sub 1. At least 60% of the gross floor area of the projected housing development is dedicated to housing. So you could look at the housing development plan, see that this is the case, get through the door for the project criterion. Or perhaps you're at a threshold, or perhaps you're doing something different with your project, but it would actually help the community with its housing needs. You could try for this subdivision 2, the projected housing development will meaningfully address the housing needs of the community as determined by this board, which we'll come to later upon request of the council. And so this would be a board that is set up for this program that would, upon request of the council, be able to respond to projects that don't meet this sub 1, basically. And they could say, they could make a determination, we think that this is meaningfully contributing to the housing needs of the community. I would flag that you have this quite broad language, meaningfully address the housing needs of the community. I think the goal here is to try to get at something that is saying this really is a housing project. It really is helping the housing community, but not being too prescriptive as to what that means to meet that. You could build this out in other ways by saying, for instance, that they have to look at the statewide housing needs assessment, or there's particular things they have to examine to make this determination. But right now, the language you see is just to get the concept across, and it's quite broad, meaningfully address the housing needs of the community.
So some municipalities have planning requirements that require the bottom floor to be business. And if you're only doing 2 stories, the best you're going to get is 50%.
So that's why we have 2 different things built in here. So if they don't meet the 60% threshold, then this new board can look at that project and weigh it all and say, yeah, it's meaningful for the community. It can, it'll go forward. Otherwise, if we just, that's why there was people had a lot of issues with putting a percentage in there. And if you don't meet those percentages, and how, then we may be leaving good projects on the side of the road.
More of a technical thing, but I see here it says 60% of the gross floor area of projected housing development, but yet in definitions,
Yes.
we say a projected housing development is 60% of the gross floor area. Can you explain to me why we have the redundancy?
When I want people to, this is something I think about, I try to avoid creating circularity, which is so easy to do in these sections. I want people to be able to look at the definitions section and know what a housing development is, but this is definitely something I think about, and I'm happy to think more about this, because it's silly if when you plug in the definition, like you literally copy and pasted the definition into it, say at least 60% of the, at least 60% of. So for sure, I will. Another way to do this is just to say housing development is the thing approved under subsection 1910D. So I'm always trying to balance providing helpful information in the definition section, but I'm with you. I'm with you. Circularity, bad. Yes.
So in that second portion, that as determined by the community, the CHIP board, upon request of the council, does that mean that the council can make that assessment without asking the board? Can they do it themselves?
That is definitely not the intent.
Right.
I think this could be tightened up to make clear that it has to be. I mean, it's clear that it has to be I think it does have to be a determination of the board as written. I can try to think about if there's a way to make that even stronger, but I read this to say as determined, right? The as determined picks up each time you look to this sub 2, it would pick up that determination. Yeah, I was just trying to make clear that it's only at the request of the council that they undertake this activity.
Okay, so the council can look at one that's got 58%, it's less than 60, but for other reasons, the council is not supportive of this project. They don't have to then ask the CHIP board if it meaningfully addresses it. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah. If Vepsi did not reach out, as written, if Vepsi did not reach out to this board, the only avenue for a project to get through would be sub 1.
Okay.
If you would like to make it such, because I think part of what you're asking is, could you have something that doesn't meet the threshold and Vepsi decides not to ask the question? And if you don't want that to happen, I think, need to change this.
And then, and the intent of this is that only the CHIP board can determine whether a project meaningfully addresses the housing needs of the community.
Exactly.
The council cannot.
The council cannot.
Okay. And what? And can I? So maybe this is I'm not sure where the language is coming from, so so the question is, why is the council not able to make that determination?
Oh, I think that's a question for you.
For who?
Yeah, for commit, not for me to.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, so I would like to hear, whoever knows the answer to that, I would like to hear that. But we can get to that whenever we get to that.
So,
Or no, Jeff, Mike.
so I'm gonna make a somewhat different statement on this section right here. The Community Housing Infrastructure Program Board. I look across the table here. You're from Whitingham. You're from Powell, and you're from,
Starksburg.
don't know anything about your communities. To be quite honest, I don't think I've ever heard of them until I met you guys.
They're- Hey?
Yes.
Bar.
So, and I point that out because I don't know what your community needs are, but you know what? All three of you probably have select boards, correct? Your select boards know your community's needs and your housing needs in your community. And by having the requirement that the municipality sign on to this, they're addressing the needs, not some random person that's never heard of your community. You would not want me on this board because I don't know your community.
So are you saying like maybe there needs to be like a statement of need, like a demonstrated statement of need or
I
something?
think we'll get to where who is on this board. We haven't gotten to that point yet. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah,
But and what you're saying is the municipality never would have put this through if they didn't think this would help a need. And we're looking at statewide dollars. So because a municipality believes it's okay as legislators responsible for the funds of the whole state, it probably makes sense for us to have an additional statewide check on how that statewide money is going to be spent.
And my rebuttal would be Vepsi, right? They're already doing the check. But a board that's created, they don't know what the needs are of the community. They just, that's all.
Setting aside statewide dollars issue, because I think that's complicated in terms of whether we're really taking or pay
We're
statewide dollars.
using leverage of statewide dollars to get better rates for these project infrastructure at a minimum.
Well,
At a minimum.
but that gets into that whole issue about, are we really doing something to detriment the ed fund? And I think that's a complicated issue that, lots of people differ about. But what's that?
The question is.
My question is, you have some sort of some regulatory structures where when you have sort of a discretionary issue, I'm thinking of the regional Act 250 boards. They have a process for not really sure where something is meets the criteria or not, and so there's a process. It seems like when you were drafting this, we think of other regulatory structures like that where you can get a preview, because otherwise the applicant might not know. It's pretty much up in the air. Is this going to be approved or not?
I would say the applicant's in that position either way, regardless of the board, right? Because they're also facing, like, if you don't have this, they're still in that position with Pepsi too, in terms of they don't know until they know, right? Unless I'm misunderstanding the.
Well, except that the subdivision 1 is pretty clear.
Oh, you're
going to know.
Yes, for sure.
Whereas subdivision 2, you're really not going to know. And I just aware of some other.
Yeah, I mean,
sort of regulatory structures where you can get a heads up, of whether it's going to be, because that would influence whether you can apply it all.
so
And if you don't even know, if you're really unclear about whether it's going to be approved, you might not apply.
yeah, and maybe my personal read is not necessarily helpful in this context, but the way that I take this is you could just have let's say here you have in sub 1 60% of gross floor area, you could just have that, right? This is making another option available so that folks want to try for something else, but it is trying to push,
Yeah, I know.
it's trying to push heavy housing is the way that I read this, and then saying, but you may be able to get through if you get this determination. So I don't think you're misreading it. I think it's intentional
Yeah.
that folks might say, well, maybe my project isn't going to work through CHIP.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
So John, we still don't have a minimum amount of housing that needs to be constructed
Because of the building piece.
to avail folks of the funds, right? One house is still enough.
Yes, I think what you're identifying is the tie between construction of one or more buildings in which the gross floor area would be the 60%. And so you could satisfy that with having a building that meets that, and then you could develop other pieces. So the route that you could go is to have the construction, like the new construction or on the housing development site must meet that. And I think that would solve your problem. I think that's the answer to the piece, just to make sure that any development that's happening on the housing development site picks up this 60% constraint. So no other.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm asking is a single house would still be enough to get funding for this infrastructure.
It would be enough to get you into the program, but probably financially it makes little sense for someone to go through CHIP just to build a house when they couldn't build anything else on the housing development site, right? Maybe off of the housing development site, they're like, hey, great, this infrastructure went in. And now I'm going to take advantage of it, and I'm just going to create a housing development site with one net. So there may be
I just
how you would
wanted to make
address.
sure that I was understanding that that's still there.
I think the
Incentivizing clustering with the way it's written.
Not yet.
I think this is a part of an interaction of like what practically will happen and how the language is working. Because I definitely take the former point that if you keep the language for housing development as one or more buildings that meets, then literally on the housing development site, you could have one building that does that and the other buildings don't. Practically, I don't know how common that would be, but your point is broader than that, which is that even if you the available parcel for the housing development site and did dedicate that entirely to housing, could be that the reason you pursued the financing would be to do something offsite, basically. And I don't know the answer to how you would try to get at this, because you would start having to contemplate a larger geographic area, and it's starting to sound more like big TIF district. And the other thing that you could offer in response to that was you do get two benefits there, right? You get infrastructure and you get a house. And then if someone happens to take advantage of it in some other way, you've still gotten things that that's probably not a satisfactory answer, but just to say,
I think what you said is it's complicated,
yeah,
and that's fair.
I would have to think about how to try to get it like off, like people routing the projects they really want to do off-site to take advantage of the infrastructure through this. It's a good point. Yeah.
Also, there's another thing on the clustering. It could also be clusters within one single like housing structure. Or it also could be a dispersed cluster. And that
What is the? Can you tell me get up to speed on the clustering?
clustering, the idea of especially in tier 2, incentivizing more clustered, closer together development as opposed to avoid the risk of sprawl.
So tier 2 is out of this bill.
Yep. We haven't gotten there yet, but that's what we'll be in.
Or
1 minute.
just, and that's, I mean, not even just tier 2, just I think in general, the idea is to incentivize more closely built structures.
We have a cluster chapter in our planning.
Well, yeah, I mean, but it's there in the municipal. I was wondering if the municipality, the municipality regulations speak to that. And
Well, that's also dependent on the municipality, right? Because everybody's zoning laws are
Why don't we
different.
let John keep going through this bill, and we can get back to committee discussion after we see all the new language and figure out what we want to modify in the next round.
It's good to me. Location criteria or what come next, and that's what you're seeing. Well, you don't see it. You see the really light highlighting. that's trying to draw your attention to an area where something no longer exists. So previously your subdivision 2 here for your location criteria, so where this housing development site has to be located, could have been tier 2, and there was a proxy for that as well, that you could receive a letter from the RPC essentially approving it. That tier, that subdivision has been removed. And so your location criteria that you're left with are your tier 1A or tier 2, or meeting that interim housing exemption until that comes into effect, or existing settlement or an area within 1/2 mile. And my understanding is, I think, was Ellen in here yesterday to, okay. So someone has covered these things that I cannot cover.
So is this the only place where this draft touches on the issue of infrastructure in tier 2?
This is we're talking about the application section. So this is where the housing development site has to be located. Anything that goes through this program, any housing development site. But I do want to be clear that infrastructure, and I don't know how commonly this would be the case, but theoretically the infrastructure could fall outside of that, because the restriction here is housing development site, but presumably they're in close proximity. So I'm guessing that's
Right, but this basically says that if the housing development is in a tier 2 area, it's not eligible for.
That's right. You're not getting through this application process.
So since you last heard direction,
Okay.
there had been more discussions about tier 2 with a delayed start time, or more language around having tier 2 housing that is built more compactly. So
Okay.
we will be giving you.
Okay. And then something I would offer on that front is, if you're trying to have a kind of a delayed piece, there's a way to do it with the language that you had before that just drops off the RPC letter piece, and it just says an area designated tier 2, and nothing would be designated tier 2 until it exists. So it would be in place, but it would be meaningless until it was live, basically. I don't know when it's being designated, so.
Lisa.
The way I read this, it says tier 1, tier 1B, or an existing settlement. And that would lead me to believe, and maybe there's no such thing, that the second part, as long as it's in 1/2 mile of an existing settlement, it doesn't matter where it's categorized.
That's correct.
So, I mean, are there tier 2 areas like that?
Those would be permissible under this. So I should have, yes, I'm sorry that I didn't. The second piece is independent of the tiers, the existing settlement. So if you're in tier 2, you're an existing settlement, or that 1/2 mile, you do meet. I just don't know the tiers to like that.
Perhaps not the right question. Do you remember how that term is defined in subdivision? Or you were deferring, I think, to Ellen there.
I can pull it up if that's.
Yeah.
Um,
I just know, I don't know about you, Tony, I don't know of anything in our maps right now that designate settlement areas under this. So I'm just curious what.
I can pull it up. I'm not gonna have thoughts about it because it's.
Yeah.
It would be dangerous for me to try to offer.
My understanding of tier 2 is it's basically the catch-all. If you're not in the other ones, and those areas are subject to traditional Act 250.
Right, I just didn't understand
Yeah,
what
what
16
settlement area.
meant and how broad that definition is.
Just a second.
Existing settlement?
I've got it.
It's
It's up on
a
the-
settlement or a settlement area, it's the house. Sure.
Do you guys want me to, one of the following, designated center? I don't know what that is, or an existing center that is compact in form and size, that contains a mixture of uses, including a substantial residential component, that are within walking distance of each other, that is significantly higher density than densities that occur outside, typically served by municipal infrastructure. So I feel like I recall in the beginning of these discussions that these would be areas in which it would be less necessary to produce the infrastructure, right? So like the conceptual justification behind the program, but it's not to say that you couldn't meet those things. And you'll note too that strip development doesn't constitute. So if you happen to be strip development, you're not falling for that. But I don't really have anything to offer here other than this is what the statute looks like.
And I think Ellen said that concept was going to be taken over by some of the other provisions and active in.
2027, it goes away. Yep.
Right, so if we,
So it's the interim
By 20
until tier 2 is
right,
established.
right, but if just laying it out the way the draft lays it out, any opportunity for housing in tier 2 would go away in 2027.
Unless you included back in this proposal, which is to have tier 2 pieces.
What we just mentioned to John minutes ago.
My apologies.
Great.
Let me jump back to the draft here. Like, pause?
Well, when you were talking about adding it back in, but it was a caveat included with it, and I can't remember what the caveat was.
Density.
Okay.
Right, that's what we talked about as a committee.
Yeah, that was gonna be,
Yesterday. Am I misremembering?
no,
Well, we talked about it, but I don't know if
And this is until we see what it looks like on
Yeah.
paper, it's hard to know exactly what it is. So,
this is like the stopgap to try to get us through to the other side. And when tier 2 is established, this would go, that would go away. Number 2 would go away. Am I understanding that?
As you guys just described it, I don't know. What I just heard is that existing settlement is going away once tier 2 comes into place. So if you had this language in the draft, it would be
It
meaningless
would
at
be
that point.
meaningless.
The next pieces, sorry, I don't want to just scroll. Let me pause and we can jump down to page 13. Section 1910C, the use of tax increment retention period. So this, we're going to be talking about your retention percentages. For your education property tax increment, we had talked before, what you received from the Senate was up to 80% of that education property tax increment. This is reverting to what exists in place currently for TIF districts, so 70%. And for your municipal, you'll recall that the version as passed by the House was not less than 100% retention, so full usage of that. And that produced some knock-on effects that direct municipal expenses for related costs wouldn't be coverable with excess increment because you'd be fully using that 100. So this is just aligning with the percentages that are in place for TIF districts now, so 70 and 85%. On page 14, you're going to see updates to the excess tax increment. We talked before about the mechanics that happen if you receive increments that exceed what you've committed in a particular year, and it included things like putting an account to pay for future financing, prepaying, or defeasing. And one thing that was discussed was if there are ways to ensure that you're funneling as much as you can to the ed fund during a project. And so what this does is narrows the scope of what those excess mechanics would do. And it says of that excess, up to 30% beyond what is committed may be retained to place in an account and used to offset the payment of financing and related costs in any year in which no tax increment is generated, provided that any excess tax increment retained shall be distributed to that fund upon retirement of all financing. So practically what this means is if you are covering what you've committed in any particular year with your increments, you can only hold on to 30% of what is retained above that. And the only use of that retained excess is if your property values decline within the housing development site, basically. Only in those years could you use it to offset the payments. And if you never used it, in any event, it would have to be provided to the ed fund at the end of the period. That's practically what this is achieving. Does that make sense? It's narrowing what the mechanics for excess increment are. You wouldn't be able to put them aside for future financing, prepay interest and the like. You would just cover what you commit in a year and you'd retain a particular percentage. I would say the percentage here is arbitrarily chosen. I just tossed in a number to think about.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so current TIF is if it goes below, municipality is on the tab for that.
And the case here too.
Can this be read to say that up to 30% can be retained every year? So it can accumulate, or is that,
That's the way that I think about it. In any tax year that you've exceeded the amount, so any year in which you've produced in excess, up to 30% of that may be retained, and it would be just collecting this account, right? You would each year, if you have excess, and we don't know if folks will have excess, but in each year you could pick up that 30%. And it might never go to use, and then at the end, basically, you would have this lump sum that would flow up to the ed fund. Was that the intention, or have I misunderstood the? I mean, you could have a cap as well. You could say like up to 30%, but no more. Because it would be project specific.
processing, just taking in information?
Shall I stay here or keep going?
Folks have more questions on this? You have a question?
Yeah, so currently, under current TIF, are you able to bank that amount of
Yes.
money?
You can bank excess increment in current. That's what this is addressing, is that folks could just take their and I should say, they take a percentage. It's not as if they take the whole of the excess, right? They take a percentage of the excess and they can put it into account for the idea that they might finance future projects. And the result is that you've taken money that would have gone to the ed fund on the possibility that you might pursue other lines of financing. And something that's also different in this context for the project specific approach is that I don't know if folks are going to envision a bunch of different lines of financing for a project, right? It's not a broad geographic district. Maybe they do, but for a broad geographic district, you're saying this project may come up, this project may come up. I don't know what's going to happen. Presumably you have some sense, otherwise you wouldn't have pursued the district, but things could happen across the course. Whereas for a project specific approach to tax increment financing, you're talking about folks going in, knowing exactly what they're trying to fund, right? And so I would also say some of the excess mechanics maybe conceptually make slightly less sense for the project. It's not to say that you couldn't hold on to those mechanics. That's what the draft as passed by the Senate did, but this narrows what you can use the excess for. Does that make sense?
Other questions?
See what's next. We can, yes, okay, directly next section, starting on page 15. This is section 1910D. This is your information reporting section. And so just a few additions on page 16. And just to call out, this is subsection B. This is your VEPSI report to the legislature. And necessarily they would have to receive this information from the municipality. So it would be in a form, basically, that they send out to the municipalities to provide this information. The few new pieces that you see here, you'll know before that we talked about how some of the information that would have to be provided is what improvements actually happen and how many housing units are created. Some additional information that you see in subdivisions 5 and 6, expected or actual sale and rental prices of any housing units and the number of housing units known to be occupied on a basis other than as a primary residence. So trying to identify if this is creating housing that's not going. But I would say this is relatively weak language to meet this standard. It's that the muni would need to know that it's occupied on a basis other than as a primary residence. I don't know if they're tracking that. So only if they knew that would they be obligated to provide that information. And so who's to say if this would be especially effective? The other way to do this would be tasking the municipality to actually determine what is happening with these primary residents. This is a light touch, I would say, to trying to get at what's happening with the housing. And you can think of it as, instead of including this as a specific project criterion, right? Like covenants and the like that do this, this is just saying, give us the information if this is what's happening. And it would be a condition, right, of getting through this program. So not something that applies generally throughout the state, but if you're availing yourself of CHIP, this would be one of the things that you would need to do, is provide information on if you know housing units being produced would be occupied on a basis other than its primary residence. So
One concern I have with that is, you could own a rental property and you would be considered other than primary residence.
I think that's still a primary residence. It's occupied as a primary residence
Okay,
by the.
I gotcha.
Exactly. The intent here, and certainly worth thinking about if it does capture it, is to try to get at second homes, investment properties, that sort of thing, things that are not occupied year round. And that's another way to put it, but I think primary residence captures that.
Okay.
concept. So a rental, you wouldn't have to report. The other piece that's added here is just a slight update to the allocation of incremental revenue to say this needs to call out amounts allocated to related costs. I did take a look at the reports that VEPSI does annually to see if in their reporting on the allocation of incremental revenue, they include this. I didn't see it there, so that's why it's called out here. But this is just trying to get at where do those incremental revenues go? Are they going to financing of the improvement, or is it going to municipal expenses to administrate the program? In both cases, those are coverable. It's not changing anything about that. It's just getting information on where the financing is going.
Were there other places, committee, that we wanted to get back on that annual report? I know we talked about lots of different things, but I remember if anybody had anything that wasn't included.
I had some notes too.
And again, there's a, 10-year, 5-year, we haven't figured out a bigger report to come back later, but this is the annual reporting back from VEPSI.
Well, I'm not sure if Betsy is the one to do this, but it would certainly be interesting to know some information about the grand list and the municipality where the development's taking place in order to try to get a handle on the value of the program itself. I think as someone explained earlier, if the additional grand list increment has been really low over the period over a certain period of time, and you could see that the grand list is now higher because of the program. I'm not sure whether Betsy is the one to do that, but that would certainly answer one of the questions or help to answer one of the questions that we've been talking about.
I mean, I think one of the things that you would necessarily know is by knowing the increments generated that there has been increases in property value, right? That has to have happened for that for those increments to be coming in, right? It wouldn't speak to the municipality as a whole.
That's what I'm thinking. Because there's been a lot of discussion around is this program really a good idea in terms of the public benefit? And without comparing it, I think, to the municipal grand list as a whole. And again, Dutchie might not be the right entity to do that. I'm just trying to think of some of the issues that we were talking about, and if we can get some data that will help us answer it.
There's likely also ways to access that information.
What's that?
There's also likely ways to access that information publicly, I would think, but
That they could pull into the report.
It's difficult. I've been trying to do a
To
little.
separate it.
Yeah, separate the grant. I mean, different towns have, better systems for keeping track of grand lists, and they can categorize, certain things. So I think it's good information. I'm not sure how to capture it, given the variety of municipalities.
Do the recurrent reports already have to do that for TIF districts?
sorry, what's the,
Do the current TIF district reports already have to do that? No, not just the district. But with the fact that this is project specific, it wouldn't be that much of a. Yes.
Let's move on it and see.
Yeah, I like the idea. I think that's what I'm.
so the next piece we can jump to is our final piece on page 19. This is creating that chip board, which we talked about when we talked about the project criterion and creating that alternative path for folks that don't meet the 60% threshold. So creating this Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board to assist BEPC with evaluating that project application pursuant to subsection 1910D, which is your project criterion subsection. The membership would be the state treasurer, the executive director of VHFA, CEO of VITA, Executive Director of the Vermont Bond Bank, and the Executive Director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. You see this bracketed language for who serves as a chair. Probably useful to call out who serves as a chair, just to know if someone needs to call a meeting. Provisionally, I had included just along the first line, I would say treasurer, but you might consider with the housing component, if this might better belong with VHFA or someone else. The membership for this, just to call out, I think was drawn from, oh gosh, yeah, the local investment advisory committee, many of those members are duplicated here. The duties are fairly slim, but they are substantial for the meaning of this program. So upon request, the board shall evaluate that housing development plan component to determine whether the proposed housing development will meaningfully serve the housing needs of the community. So one task that they have to perform, but it's conceivably quite impactful. And because we don't know how many folks are likely to pursue projects under this other avenue, this could be a pretty meaningful burden depending on the applications that folks are submitting. Just quickly, this is because it's pretty just basic stuff here. Would have the administrative and technical assistance, so setting up meetings if they need to. And I have two options set out here, Office of the State Treasurer. If the treasurer was the chair, that might make sense. But I would note that administrative assistance for the TIP program generally is provided by ACCD, and you might think that it could belong there. So a choice to be made. Board to meet upon request of VEPC, right? It's only upon this request to make this determination, standard per diems. And then this last piece here is something that you see in place for VEPC when they reject or approve applications. Decision would not be subject to contested case hearing requirements, not subject to judicial review. So this is something that folks are going to be litigating. If the board doesn't find that you meet that, not trying to create a whole arena for litigation. This is just a determination. I did see a hand pop up, so I don't know if.
I guess I'm not sure I understand the purpose of this board. I mean, we've already in this bill given VEPC authority to make these decisions. Is there a reason we need to bring this is it a second opinion, appeal from? What's the purpose?
It's an independent opinion. So the thinking is that basically VEPC has its standard route as proposed here of getting a project through the cycle, which is meet that 60% threshold. But if something doesn't go through that route, VEPC doesn't make the determination that it will meaningfully contribute to the housing needs of the community. They would reach out to this board, which is this membership that you see, which is presumed to have to offer expertise in assessing whether a project meaningfully contributes to the housing needs of the community, and they would make that determination. So it's not a duplicative thing. It's basically a second route that projects could get through that tries to take advantage of expertise that isn't housed within VEPC. Does that make sense? I understood the thinking behind it. Yeah.
These are, I'm assuming, pretty busy individuals. We may want to add designee in there.
I think because it's looking for a statewide thing and they may get called once every 3 years,
Oh, okay.
right? This is not they're not going to get requested every single project.
Okay.
That comes through.
It was just
The
a
thought
thought.
was, see how this goes and then.
But I would caution, it is possible that they would get quite regular requests, right? It could be that, let's say folks are even at a 50% threshold. And they just don't want to be on the line, right? So they want this other avenue. And because there are no caps in place, like for TIF districts, you could have hundreds of, I'm just saying that theoretically you could have hundreds of projects going and people making lots of requests. So getting some sense of what people anticipate the scope will help a lot if there's any way to know what the anticipated scope would be.
Is the idea that the final verdict from the chip board is the final verdict from the chip board, and Pepsi
doesn't touch it.
has no ability to supersede?
Exactly. It's the designation, like the thing that's required is a designation by this board that it meets the housing needs of the community. And it's just that it comes at request of Pepsi. And I can think about if there's a way to just structure that section so it's clear that it's not, because the first the main subsection talks about VEPS, right? It speaks to VEPSI, and then you have the two criteria below it, and one of them is pulling in the board. If it's helpful to try to distinguish those, so you say, here's two routes. I can,
Jonathan, did you have a question?
I think I get the language, so, it's not
yep.
it's not a question for the council.
Oh, I love that.
So we still have John for another 20 minutes, right? Do we want to talk about language for tier 2? Yeah.
I'll make the comment that just put it back in the way that it was.
I thought, didn't we come out with like a little outline yesterday about some, I guess, parameters around tier 2? Trying to encourage more concentrated development so that we are mitigating this concern about having sprawl in tier 2.
I mean, I just soon have tier 2 in there, but it's hard to evaluate that versus something that we haven't seen yet. I mean, if you want to have that discussion about those alternatives, we can do that as well.
That's what I'm looking for, yeah.
Well, then I'd like to hear again, maybe, what the alternatives are. What the alternatives are to having just, put back the same language in tier 2. Because I've heard sort of general concepts, well, we want cluster, this, but for density.
So right now, we need to give John direction so he can come back to us with language. He's not gonna write it on the spot while we look over his shoulder at what he's writing. So that's exactly what we're talking about, is what direction do we want to give John to bring us back language?
Okay.
One option might be that, for example, we would say that at the level of density greater than existing density within the municipality. Like, it's just, so there's a starting thing. We can say it has to be denser than what your town has. And that, how many units do you have? How many acres do you have? This is a very easy calculation to make. And you got to do something with more units per acre than that.
It really probably depends on the town. I mean,
It would be a town by town assessment.
town by town thing. So, I know planning and zoning in some municipalities that are already doing that, right? In terms of, they gotten way away from minimal lot sizes, and it's all about density. So would the concept be that you have to have even more density, and trying to figure that out would maybe depend on what the existing density requires.
And I feel like that will come up in any conversation about developing housing in any part of the state. So, it strikes me as something that is simple, that is municipally contextualized, might allow people that are thinking about this to just sort of get a quick feel for, like, okay, this would, and the fact is that they're taking place in areas that, many municipalities have language around
Already.
Yeah, it's there. And so I feel like that's a good mechanism for us to utilize without having to burden ourselves with understanding the zoning of every municipality and state. I thought that the Regional Planning Commission's presence in the previous version was useful. Knowing that not every town will have a town plan, but every town is served by a regional planning commission. So there's a regional plan. There's at least a common thread there. So I would think of that as being a use. I thought that would be a helpful thing to include. So I wouldn't mind seeing it come back into the language.
Yeah, and to that, Act 181 is encouraging, clustering, not using, the whole field, but trying to have 10 or whatever units clustered. So it's already doing that. So that a draft provision around housing development in tier two that's said it was needing to be consistent with the regional plan, I think would make sense.
Sorry, my reaction was just thinking in terms of not at all an objection to you guys' discussion. I'm just thinking about kind of like areas of jurisdiction, like what is routed through TIF, what is routed through CHIP, what is routed through permitting processes, and like trying not too much to muddy the waters of the program. Start building in, you guys can do what you want. I'm just thinking about the difficulty of creating additional like non-tax increment financing components to a tax increment financing program, but it's not to say that it can't be done. Just
because we are dealing with there isn't an easy definition of clustered housing that we can, for example, to like, and that is part of the challenge that we're having. And so I am sensitive to that. Like,
and it's presumably why folks had the sets of tiers, right? Like you had the tier one, because you could say, well, we know, like, we don't have to think about zoning, and we just include that as a location criteria, and that set of law handles the thinking about what happens with density and the areas in which it occurs. If you start to do that, which is fine, this isn't, again, I keep saying this is not an objection, but if you start to make tier two and then complicate the analysis to mirror conditions that you might have for tier one, and I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but if you start to bring some of the same standards, yeah.
Just wondering if we can have it say something to the effect of more dense than what did you have, average housing
at a density higher than the
than
units per acre within the town.
units and only in areas that are designated, that are regionally designated for housing. So that would pull that decent, right? The municipality hopefully is only going to say that, but I think maybe that would be the backstop that gives people comfort that we're going to be doing dense housing in areas where housing is regionally seen to be needed.
Where is that a determination that's currently made?
They're making maps right now.
So maybe it's that CHIP on tier two doesn't go into effect until those maps are done,
Yes.
right? And then at that point, it's available for CHIP.
I mean, effectively, if you just had the language tier two, it wouldn't mean anything until they did exist, right? So you could have it in there and it's not real until that happens.
And then, I mean, once we know what the maps look like, and if there's more work that needs to be done, then we do the work.
I guess that is another important point to say here is it's great to have the conversation today and try to get out in front of this thing, but you also have time to resolve this very complicated question because that tier two wouldn't exist until, right?
Yeah. But I think we need to say, yes, tier two is open for CHIP. We just don't know. We just haven't looked at how that is going to be because we don't know what the maps look like to put the shape around that. And I think we're going to need time from the time the maps come out to understand what we need to do, if anything, to allow CHIP in tier two.
But in the meantime, the program wouldn't be available for housing in tier two. And what, we would need additional legislation to make it so?
There isn't tier two yet.
I understand. Tier two is a deadline in the future. I totally
But
understand that.
I mean, I think we can say that CHIP will be available for tier two. But we need to do more work. I mean, we're not going to say that legislation, but we know we need to do more work. And so we put the effective date out.
And Act 250 still applies, right?
Right.
And it's always gonna apply anyway. So, but that's up to 9 units.
So are you thinking like in type language to say?
You, you don't actually have to do anything to achieve this other than have the tier 2 listed because it's available as a location criterion, but it's not real until it is designated. Right?
But we still need to give ourselves time after it's designated. to
Yes.
Look at it, right? So we may need to push, have an effective date for it to go live, maybe 1 year after.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying you don't want it to kick in until you've made okay.
So we've had,
Okay.
until the legislatures have time to look at it and.
Kind of like a sunrise.
Which actually raises a point I should have brought up. With the board, I didn't include a termination of the board, but if you're maintaining that sunset structure, it would make sense for that board to go away in 2035 as well.
The list of.
Right, so.
Yeah.
Do we have time to think more about the board? I'm still struggling with the board.
So Jonathan was wondering why it's a board separate from Betsy. Hoping you would answer that.
I'm free at lunch.
We can talk about it. I can, yeah.
So, I mean, just generally, the concern about how, I mean, I understand conceptually what you're talking about. The first thought is I still don't know why we don't want to promote housing, in some of these rural areas. And I'm not sure.
What do you
why
mean
we-
by that? Or what do you mean by not promoting that?
Well, the program will not be available.
Well, it can't be available because there's no tier 2 yet.
Well, the way the Senate bill is constructed, there are two possibilities.
So they're gonna use the tier 2
When it co-
exemption that's in there right now? Is that what you're,
That's what the Senate bill says. It has two options. Tier 2, which obviously won't be defined until the boundaries are made, or the project is compatible with the regional plan. And what I'm hearing is this idea about sunrising, tier 2 would dispense with that second criteria so that between now and when, a year or so after tier 2 is created, the program would not be available to incent housing in these areas.
so you need to think about the other piece to this. Is that there is a concern because we don't know yet what the take rate is going to be on 1A, 1B, right? And we also have a TIF program that's ongoing that I think our Ways and Means Committee is concerned that we bite off too much. And so until they get data back, they're okay with pushing off tier 2 until we get some data back from what's going on with 1A, 1B. And I can't, and I can't,
hear you.
and I know I'm not gonna change your mind,
Yeah.
but we're not gonna change their mind either. So
Yeah.
I think that by us stating that tier 2 is going to be available is better than not putting tier 2 in at all.
Or, I think you put it well, I think a few days ago, that we had so much choice, right? We could butt out of it or struggle a pill that we liked, that might include tier 2 as, being an eligible location. And it would get in trouble, later on. Or we could try to, accommodate somehow the folks that were,
Well,
giving
I
us
think it's-
headwinds.
As much compromise as we can do in here right now.
Yeah.
Shortens the time span that the bill needs to take when it goes over to housing and up to Ways and Means and so that we can get it to move. So
I totally understand that. What I'm trying to grasp is, what's gonna, if we just decide to vote on a bill that we really are comfortable with, what's gonna happen? And
maybe you might not be comfortable with it.
yeah, but I'm trying to make that choice, right? Of delayed gratification, I guess. Versus trying to do something that, we think really makes sense.
I've always found that compromise goes a long way. And that if we can put a bill out that we've compromised on, that'll go a long. So,
Yeah.
I guess can take it with a grain of salt, but that's,
No, I don't
Yeah.
take it with a grain of salt at all.
so, and I hear, I know, I think most of us here are in rural communities, and I know that they're all clamoring for something that can help increase, well, not all of them. There's some communities that don't want to grow. But there are a lot of communities out there that want to grow, and it seems like second tier is a place for those real small communities to grow, but there's a reality of that there's unsurety of the capacity of the ed fund to be able to provide for everything all at once. And so without us having the data to bring more confidence that we're not going to bankrupt the ed fund. Then probably bankrupt is too harsh of a word, but take out too much that we need to get some data back. So, and I think things aren't going to happen within the next year.
I mean, I'm bankrupting the ed fund. Partially.
Significantly decreased.
Yeah, whatever. There's also an issue of, so who's, what locations are gonna be paying for this? And what would,
All locations.
and what, no, if this benefit isn't here, the increment that would otherwise go to the ed fund from one A and B, that's gonna benefit, more power to them, wonderful. But there is, who's benefiting? And these other towns that aren't included in this are in a sense paying for development in other places.
Possibly. It depends on how much money they're getting back
I
on it
understand.
to pay for their school. So a lot of communities are getting more back than what they pay in. That's the way the system's set up, right? That's the way it's supposed to be.
Oh, it is now.
Yeah, and I think everything every time we talk about benefits and benefits to the ed fund and the benefits to the investments that we make are far outweigh. I think everybody that sits here gets that. Unfortunately, it's not universal, but
Correct.
so it makes interesting life. One other thing to think about and is, does it make more sense on the money that's going back to the ed fund once, we talked about the percentage and they're allowed to keep the percent and all that? Would it make more sense if they're every year they keep whatever that growth is and the following year they have to pay it in? So that they're retaining all of the overage. So that if something comes up, they have the money to pay for the, whatever the bond or whatever they're paying, the debt. And then they just send the money back in, send it in the following year. Instead of trying to retain it, us trying to figure out a percentage.
And that still keeps the stipulation that that money would have to be used toward, what was it, like maintenance or paying the bond or something.
Well, I think on the municipal side, what they keep would be for maintenance of infrastructure.
Yeah,
And on the
Yeah.
ed side, they just hold on to that. And then the following year, they send it in.
but that.
So
They're just holding it.
They're holding
they're not
it.
Spending it,
Unless,
unless. they-
I think unless they need to make it, unless they're not capturing enough
And they need to make.
on the
a
increment
payment,
to make that
The
payment.
debt payment, okay, that was what I was asking, it doesn't have the limitation of only being used for the
Right,
debt payment.
yeah.
Then I'm cool with it.
I do have to run, but yeah, reach out if you guys have other thoughts. And practically is the thinking, I guess, what is the goal in terms of getting this to, I guess it's just going to ride on how folks react to the language. Okay. Just based on the tenor of this conversation, I'm guessing it is a next week thing unless a lot of.
Depends on your availability and how much you can drive and when you can be in here. That's,
Okay.
We have time at 3.
Uh,
Easy to- totally.
I no longer pick up on sarcasm. Someone was, I was asking someone for like language direction yesterday and they were completely messing with me and I was like, are you being real? Like, I can't tell.
So head down.
Well, it's like we often get insane requests, so I'm like, I can't tell.
I just mentioned one other thing, when, I think we were out when we were talking, or at least I was talking about wanting to see some amendment to at least put a marker for future years and a report back on including, wait a sec, John.
He has to go, he has to go.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
we can, we'll
we'll
get
fill in
information to
if we
him.
need to.
And I
No,
think
go ahead, though, but keep going
You're
there.
fine.
Don't stop.
we're still live.
Yeah. We just talked briefly about, well, I talked briefly, I guess, about the original program had housing construction itself as something that would be eligible for the program. And so what I was thinking about was some report back.
Mhm.
After you have a little experience with the infrastructure part of that, to report back to, so it'd be a marker to people to look at. Jesus, should we expand the program to actual housing construction?
Yeah, I think that can be tied to, how many housing units been built or in the process. Reasons why if we're not getting people utilizing the chip, and why is that one of the reasons why, or would that help?
And I'm also-
Yeah, because I think there's gonna be a lot of other factors too.
There's a lot of other factors, and it also might, you
Well,
have a
will
little
that help stimulate more growth, right?
stimulate more growth, but also, get a better handle on whether there are negative impacts of the program, and whether those are warranted.
So I'm making notes on this, Herb, and one of the things that's in the bill is a 10-year report. And I think this makes sense to bring it back to like a 3 or a 5-year report and add some of these
Yeah.
things in that we could actually use to change. The 10-year report feels like it's designed to see if the program should even continue.
Right.
But what we're talking about is how do we keep making it better in the process? So am I hearing what you're saying?
Correct. I looked at 35 and that seemed far too far away. Yeah, well, I think I had written something. A couple of years or something.
Yeah, and we didn't have time to talk about that with John today, but we can
Yeah.
find him before he comes back to us. and
Yeah.
have that.
Okay. Makes sense.
Right.
Okay, so we're on the floor at 1. I heard it's gonna be very short. So we'll come back here and we'll start taking a look at S-17. More discussion if we need it. Go off live.